Well, welcome to lesson 2 of our 8 lessons in our online webinar pre-license class. My name is Jack Gately, and I'm a real estate broker in Massachusetts, owner of Jack Gately Real Estate, and owner of this real estate school. So let's get into the lesson of that we're going to learn today in lesson number 2. And lesson number 2 is all about transferring title. Now, when we talk about title, I find that we get a lot of different questions about the difference between title versus the deed. The deed. What do those two words mean? Well, the deed is the written intent to transfer ownership. Basically it's the sales slip. If you think about it as the sales slip, is that two words? I think it is. The sales slip or the receipt for your real estate transaction, and we are talking about real estate, of course. The deed is the sales slip. It's the written intent to transfer ownership. Wow, that sounds like a test question right there. Whereas the title is an abstract concept. It doesn't actually exist on paper. There's no paper here. You can only assert what we call the flag of title. The flag of title. In other words, you can assert your ownership, but there isn't anything that you can actually hold in the palm of your hand to say that you actually have ownership. Unlike an automobile, for instance, with an automobile, you can have the sales slip from an automobile, right? The bill of sale from an automobile. Bill of sale. And then you can get at the Registry of Motor Vehicles the actual title after you pay off your car loan. Should you be fortunate enough to pay off your car loan, or if you're like me and you buy little bit older used cars, then you can get the title eventually. And it's an actual piece of paper for a car. But for a piece of real estate, there is no piece of paper that says title at the top of the page. There's only a piece of paper that says deed at the top of the page. So that's an important distinction. Title is a real thing for real estate, but it's not a piece of paper that you hold in your hand. The only piece of paper that you hold in your hand for real estate is the deed itself. So very important distinction as we head into this lesson. Let's just remember the deed is basically the sales slip. The sales slip. I'm not sure if there's two words there, and I know there's not an E at the end, like a certain person that we used to know from vice presidential person. Sorry, I just kind of threw that little E there at the end. Sorry about that. Hey, you know, I'm honest, I'm real. I threw it in there. Can't joke, can't lie about it. You saw it. I know you did. I tried to erase it, but I know you saw it. So, so the deed. Let's try that again. The deed is the sales slip. Okay. There we go. That's better, isn't it? So that's a very important concept. Remember, too, that all the cost of preparing the deed fall on the seller for the most part, with some rare exceptions. Just like at the store, when you buy something, the store prepares the sales slip, don't they? They're in charge of drafting the sales slip, printing it out on the paper, presenting it to the customer. They bear the burden of programming the barcodes and all of that. That's their responsibility, the seller's responsibility to prepare the deed. Seller's responsibility. So if you continue on this analogy and memorize it for the exam and for real life, you'll have mastered the concept. And of course, there is no actual piece of paper that says the title. The title is an abstract concept. So when we talk about title, however, and transferring property and deeds. The best way to think about it, there's basically three types of deeds. three types of deeds that you need to know for the exam. The first is going to be the general warranty deed. The general warranty deed. We're going to go over all of these for you. The next one is going to be the special warranty deed. Just get them up there for you so you can see it. And the third one, that's a Q, by the way, is the quit claim deed. Quit claim. Quit. That's better. Quit claim. Quit claim deed. And these are your three types of deeds that you're going to need to know for the exam. And let's go through all three of them for you right now. So the best type of warranty deed that you can get, or sales slip if you want to think about it like that, is the general warranty deed, which includes especially the covenant of season. I can't pronounce that one. I'm sure you'll find other people that pronounce it differently. Basically, this covenant says that we, the sellers, actually own the property and can sell it to you. The next one would be a covenant of warranty, where the sellers promise to compensate the buyer should the buyer lose the property or have trouble transferring title in the future. I should say that's probably the better definition of it. I think the best way to look at a general warranty deed would be to draw a little diagram. So if today is the day of closing, represented by this little dot right here, then the general warranty deed protects the buyer for everything during the seller's term of ownership, and if this is graphed on time. So every time, as long as the seller had it, this is the seller's term of ownership, plus anything that happened before the seller owned it on a timeline. So this is obviously time. Going towards the next type of deed that you need to know about is the special warranty deed. The special warranty deed, and charting that in the same way, you start on the day of closing, and it protects the buyer for anything that happened during the seller's term of ownership. So if something bad happened way back here, back in the olden days, so to speak, the buyer is not protected from that when they buy it and are issued a special warranty deed. So if there was some type of old easement granted a long time ago, they're not protected if it happened prior to the seller's term of ownership. But the most common type of deed, at least here in Massachusetts, is the quit-claim deed, which basically means that on the day of closing, you don't get any warranty. So that basically the seller's selling it to you, and notice how I'm not drawing a line over here, because basically the seller's selling their interest as they own it that day. And if you think about it from a business point of view, or even from a commercial point of view, you buy a item at a store. Let's just say you buy a box of pens at Staples. Staples is giving you kind of a general warranty deed. They're giving you this type of warranty deed. They're saying that no one's going to stop you in the parking lot and say, hey, some of those pens in the box are mine. But when you buy a piece of real estate, for the most part in Massachusetts, they're giving you a quit-claim deed, which means that after you buy it, someone could come up to you and say, hey, some of those pens or some of that real estate is theirs. Therefore, under the quit-claim system, which is the predominant way to buy a piece of real estate in Massachusetts, it creates a tremendous amount of market insecurity. So how do you solve that problem of market insecurity? If someone can stop you in the parking lot and say, hey, congratulations on purchasing the real estate at the Registry of Deeds today, but by the way, some of that real estate belongs to me. How can you protect yourself for that? Well, you buy insurance, and that's going to bring us to title insurance. Let's talk about that, because it's title insurance that actually brings a increased level of market confidence, so that you as a buyer can go forward. You're not going to put down a bunch of money and get a quit claim deed from the seller saying, hey, good luck with that. No, you're going to want some type of assurance, title insurance. And that's why we have title insurance. So when we have title insurance, they go back and they look at everything that happened in the past. The title insurance company does. There's specialists that do this, and they make sure that there are no other claims against the title in full or in part. So let's talk more about title insurance. So title insurance. Title insurance, what does that mean? Well, because you're buying the piece of property, usually with a quitclaim deed, in which case the owner is not giving you any insurance or assurance that there couldn't be any other claims of title, you're going to hire a title insurance company. This is usually acquired through the lawyer who is closing the deal in Massachusetts. It's usually a fee that the buyer pays. Currently $400, $500, $600 isn't uncommon, and basically the title insurance company has contractors that go to the registry of deeds on a daily basis and they look up titles, and what they're looking for is what we call the chain of title. You can even draw a little chain there we go, chain of title. And that's not too good of a chain. That's the connect the chain. It's only as strong as its weakest link, right? So apparently my drawing skills might be the weakest link. But they're going to be looking at the chain of title, and they're going to be looking for defects in the title. They're going to be looking for prior claims. What is the prior claims going to be? And of course, what are the liens? Of course, they're expecting to see things like the existing mortgage. That's going to pop up for sure. But if there is a, how should we say this, prior mechanics lien on the property, or the IRS has placed a lien on the property, those things may not have been disclosed up until this point, and sometimes they're discovered when the title search is conducted. So the title search happens, they look at the chain of title, which is obviously a chronological history of everything. Every piece of paper that involved with this process is the chain of title. They're looking at how it's been transferred in the past, and then they're going to come forward and say, hey, we either have a problem with this type of title, and that's not a phone call you want to get from a real estate agent's perspective, or we can go forward, we'll issue the insurance. And this insurance protects, it's a one-time fee, protects the buyer to make sure that no one comes forward in the future to claim that, hey, this piece of property was transferred and my interests were either diminished or erased entirely or somehow not satisfied. So obviously the title insurance company isn't going to offer that type of insurance, for which they'd be on the hook for, unless, of course, they can go forward and research the whole issue in advance. So that's what title insurance is. It's a one-time fee. It's overseen in part, one of the industry standards out there is the American Land Title Association. You may hear that phrase by coincidence, by the way. It's called ALTA, American Land Title Association. You'll see that phrase out there from time to time. There you go, just FYI, probably not on the exam, but it's a good little phrase to know. It's the national organization that deals with title issues. So what do we have what happens when we have, which occasionally does in Massachusetts, when there's so many clouds on the title? So the title search is done, and it comes up with clouds. It's cloudy. It's a cloudy title search. Let's see if we can draw a cloud. Yeah, that's not bad. And you got a lot of them, so it might be even raining out. These are problems with the title. Problems with the title. So maybe multiple problems with the title. You're going to make an effort to what we call quiet the title. Quiet the title. That is to resolve your prior claim. So if it's a mechanics lien, of course, you're going to try to pay that off. You're going to try to quiet the title. If for some reason you have multiple claims against the title and you're having trouble marketing the property because no one wants to buy it with all these claims because no one can get title insurance, and this does happen, you might have to go and try to get what we call registered land. If I misspelt that, you forgive me, please. Registered land. So you get registered land. How do you get registered land? Well, you go to land court. Land court, and it's a slow and long, drawn-out process where you basically go before the court, and through a long and established manner, you dismiss any prior claims against title. And once you go through the land court process, which can sometimes take a very, very long time, you get what we call registered land. Registered land, because all the claims have been dismissed against it, is highly marketable. Highly marketable, and it's a great thing if you have a piece of registered land. It also means that you can market this property. There's no prior claims, and there are a lot of land out there that you need to get registered in order to market it, because there are so many prior claims against it. You know, how we've used land in the United States is an amazing thing, especially in Massachusetts, where the records go back, in many cases, 200, 300, 400 years almost. There can be claims outstanding from a long time ago, and in order to move forward with any particular project, even your basic subdivision, sometimes you have to go to the registered land level in order to clear out those prior claims. And just before we go on to the details of what must be included in the deed, and before we go on and talk about some essentials of the deeds themselves, just want to mention two other types of deeds. The first one is the sheriff's deed, which is used in the event of a foreclosure. And we haven't actually mentioned that in class yet, but a foreclosure obviously is when you don't pay your monthly mortgage bill. And a gift deed, when property is transferred for what we call love and affection. Love and affection, yes, a property can be transferred for just plain old love and affection. There's my heart. Maybe we make it with a little Cupid bow. There we go. I don't know many people that give away their property for love and affection, but I suppose it can be done. But there is a gift deed if you use or give away your land for love and affection. So just some basics of a deed. It has to be in writing. It's got to be in writing. That makes sense, right? It's going to be signed by the grantor. It has to mention the money, or what we have formally called the consideration. Remember, it's not always money, but what the seller's getting in exchange is called the consideration. The consideration. I see that we moved our screen just a little bit. Oh, I moved it again. Oh, check that out. Let's fix that for you, team. There we go. Sorry about that. So what you get in exchange for selling the land is called the consideration. The consideration. Remember, sometimes it's not money. It could be like a land swap, so it could be another piece of land. The grantor must be competent, which kind of speaks for itself. I think you know what that means. The grantee must have some type of legal standing. In other words, it must be another person or some type of legal entity to actually take ownership. You can't sell it to your cat or something like that. It has to be a description. We talked about that in Module 1, or Lesson 1, I should say, when we talked about the meets and bounds or the reticular survey, recorded plot plan, that type of thing. It has to name the parties, and it has to have a granting and addendum. Sometimes I see that sometimes spelt with an H occasionally. A granting clause in there that says, I hereby do transfer, or I hereby do grant, or convey, something along those lines. And the addendum clause is going to have something to say, to have and to hold. So those are just some of the basic things that you probably could have figured that out intuitively. I'm sure you could have, but just didn't hurt mentioning what's actually included in the deed document itself. Now, sometimes in the marketplace, a seller won't want to get an attorney, and of course, we should never discourage anyone from getting an attorney, and it's much better to encourage someone to get an attorney. But occasionally, you'll have sellers who don't hire an attorney, and they still have to get this prepared, because remember, this is going to be the seller's responsibility to prepare it, And remember that the deed itself is like the sales slip. Remember that analogy from before. So sometimes the seller will actually hire the lawyer from the lender to draft the deed for a fee, of course. And sometimes I've seen that fee nowadays go for about $100 or $200, in which case the seller will be debited that amount off the proceeds of the deal. But in the end, it's the seller's responsibility to have the deed drafted. So how do we deliver deeds? Well, we deliver deeds by paper, and it's really more of a legal thing. Yes, you can get the deed itself, but it's really a legal concept. In order for a deed to actually be delivered, the grantor, remember that's the sellor, the grantor, somebody who gives something, has to be alive, and the deed must be affirmatively accepted. Keep in mind that a deed cannot be a will, or effectively you cannot pass things down at your death through deed. You can't do that. If you want to pass something down through death, by death, a piece of real estate, you do that through a will, not through a deed. So you need to be alive from the grantor's point of view. The grantor must be upright in order for the transaction to close, and there has to be some sense of immediacy in order for the deed to be properly transferred to what we would call the grantee. This is a good time for a quick lesson on the English language, and we're going to see this all the time. We're going to see the OR and the EE at a lot of different words. For instance, like we just said, grant or and grant e. We're going to see those all the time. We sometimes might see it with less or and lease e. Oop, could be another S over there. You're going to see it all the time where you add on the OR and the EE. The OR person is always giving something to the EE person. That is the key. For instance, option or and option E. On these particular cases here, the option or is going to be the seller, and the option E is going to be the possible future buyer, in the future. So very important little English language lesson. The OR and the EE, you're going to see it all the time on real estate documents, and you really need to master this suffix. Well, that's a word we haven't heard from 3rd or 4th grade, right? The suffix OR and the suffix EE. So after we get the deed actually transferred, then we're going to record the deed at the Registry of Deeds, here in Massachusetts. That's why a lot of your closings actually occur, at least in my part of the state, they occur at the registry building itself, because it's just so easy to have everyone meet together at a table and do the closing, pass the papers right from one side of the table around, and do the closing, and then record the deed all at the same building. So it gets nice and done, and it's accomplished. And the benefit of recording the deed, you get something called constructive notice. Constructive notice. That sounds like a good vocabulary word. And basically, constructive notice is the type of notice that provides a sunshine, a transparency is the way to think about it. Constructive notice is a transparency so that you can say that you transferred your property under the public domain, that everyone could know about your transaction, even if they weren't actually up at the courthouse sitting there watching it on a day-to-day basis. It's a benefit that you are doing business above board. And that's constructive notice is actually technically a little bit different than actual notice. Ooh, that sounds like a good test question that I just said right there. Actual notice is actual notice. Constructive notice is more like a little bit of a legal fiction. You're said to have received the benefit of constructive notice even if nobody actually is paying attention. So here in Massachusetts, and most lenders have this requirement that the deed must be recorded, especially if it's underwritten by a lender. But technically, there is no requirement to record the deed if there is no lender. But there is a significant benefit through this constructive notice business that you're notifying any further or future encumbrances or people who might place encumbrances on the property. And typically the lender is going to require the deed to be recorded. And that's actually when the deed is actually the deal is actually the best way to say it, completed. And in Massachusetts, the deal really doesn't close until in the mind's eye of the attorney, everything gets done. So if this is an attorney's mind, gosh, we don't want to really speculate what's in the mind of any particular attorney, but the deed doesn't actually close, or the deal doesn't actually close until the deed does actually close, and that's in the mind's eye of the attorney. And usually they're not going to say that it's closed until they report back that we are on record. And it is very possible, and it's certainly happened to me before, where we've gone to the Registry of Deeds, we've signed everything, but occasionally, for instance, the loan would not have yet been funded, especially if you have an early morning closing. So, you have your walk through it first in the morning, you have your 9 a.m. closing. If you have a lender and maybe they're out on the West Coast or something like that, then the loan might not have been funded. And if it's not funded, then obviously the consideration hasn't changed hands yet. And if that's the case, sometimes they'll dismiss you from the courthouse and allow you to go about your day and wait for them to email you a confirmation that the transaction has been on record. And that's actually when they go up and record the transaction. That's when the lawyer does it. And technically, until you're actually on record, the transaction has not yet closed. And therefore, I usually protect myself in that I don't issue the key. I don't know if I can dare try a key. I don't issue the key until I actually get notification from the attorneys that we are on record. And you'll have this spot during the closing where the lawyers will get everything signed, the papers have been passed, and at my Registry of Deeds, if you're in the conference room, they'll go down to the main floor, they'll record the deed, and then they'll come back and say you're on record. At that point, we issue the keys and shake hands and issue the commission checks at that time too. We're going to talk about that later, or real estate fees as we prefer to call them. And it's not until that point where you're on record does the deal actually close. Okay, so before we go on record, as we just mentioned a second ago, before we go on record, we have to first have the closing. And one of the more important items leading up to the closing, of course, is to hold the deposits in escrow, or on escrow, depending upon how you want to say it. Sometimes we call those trust accounts in some parts of the country. Here we call them escrow accounts. So if we're looking at a $350,000 purchase price, it wouldn't be uncommon, of course, at the offer to select a deposit of $1,000, and then it wouldn't be uncommon, just to make the math easy for us all, at the P&S to pick up an extra $9,000. So now we have these, of course, deducted because they're already on escrow, and at the closing, the buyer still has to come up with $340,000. Now, we'll get into this later when we do the financing lesson, but some of that is going to be in cash, because unless, in most instances, some of it's going to be cash, and most likely 20% of the original purchase price will be in cash. That would be, conventional or common. And then the rest of it is often, not always, but often provided by a lender. So the real question that we're leading up to at this point is this $10,000 here, who's holding that money, and what are they doing with it, and how are they holding it? Because obviously somebody, the buyer, put down $1,000 and then put down $9,000 leading up to the transaction. So what's going on with that money? Let's talk about that. So that $10,000 in this example is being held by the escrow agent. Now, oftentimes the escrow agent is going to be the seller's agency. So the agency or the brokerage of the seller. Sometimes it could be the seller's attorney, and this heads off into a number of different important topics. But first off, why not the buyer's agency? Well, the deposit theoretically could be forfeited in the future, and in order to actually be forfeited, it would actually have to be held in trust for the seller should, heaven forbid, the transaction go belly up. And the most common way for the seller to hold the deposit is actually to have it held by an escrow agent, oftentimes a real estate brokerage. And there are certain rules, which we'll get back into later, about when they can disperse money from the escrow account, sometimes again called a trust account. But nonetheless, it's almost always held by the seller's agency. And then sometimes when you get some more sophisticated transactions, commercial transactions, for instance, larger transactions, bigger dollar amounts, sometimes by the seller's attorney. So that's what escrow is. The money is sitting in that account. Every real estate brokerage is going to have a separate escrow account, maybe several. You can have just one. However, I get that question all the time. Is it okay to have just one escrow account for multiple transactions? And the answer in Massachusetts is absolutely yes. You can have multiple transactions through one escrow account. And there's a lot of agencies that just have one. Technically, you could have more. That's where the money sits. And it sits there until the closing. And there's oftentimes, if we just can kind of obviously just kind of extrapolate and give you a kind of a good reason here, if there's $10,000 on escrow and the sales price of the property is $350,000, there's a good chance that what's owed in commission or fees is probably going to be about $17,000 and change. So as you can see, $10,000 won't be enough to cover the amount that is on escrow, and consequently there'll be an invoice that is produced by the seller's agent and the buyer's agent, and effectively at closing, after the transaction has gone on record, some of the money held in the escrow is going to be transferred to the operating account of the seller's agency, or by check to the operating account of the buyer's agency. And remember, for the exam, money in the escrow, wow, this sounds like a good test question. Not that we teach the test, but a little bit. This sounds like a test question. Money in the escrow account should never be considered future commission. Should never be considered future commission, even though from a practical point of view, it oftentimes can result or look that way, but from a legal point of view, money in the escrow account should never be a future commission. Also leading up to the closing, and remember the attorney closing the transaction, which is almost always the attorney representing the lender, is going to be preparing these documents, and these documents are going to include all the debits and credits, including the commissions and any things that are going to be due, like the deed prep that we have mentioned, all these types of fees, and what's a credit and a debit to whom has pretty much stayed the same. Anything relative to title, for instance, survey, that's all going to be on the buyer, where anything to do with the deed or paying off the old liens, that's all going to have to do with the seller. The seller, of course, and the commission is the seller. Any type of points or survey or loan application or anything like that, that's going to be due to the buyer. So there's a ledger sheet that takes these things into consideration, and something that you occasionally have to factor is some type of prorated item. Not so much on the deed prep or the title survey or anything like that, but when do we usually prorate things? Well, sometimes the seller may have overpaid for something. Let's just say that the seller has paid their real estate taxes way in advance. So the closing is on October 1st, and they've paid their real estate taxes until December 31st. So they've paid them for the entire year. And let's just say the taxes are $1,000 per month. In this particular case, since the seller has effectively overpaid, how many months of credit are they going to get? Well, the closing's October 1st. The closing is October 1st. So October, November, and December. So they're going to get 3 months of credit since they overpaid. So that's going to be a credit to the seller of $3,000. Now you see these all the time in different ways. Sometimes there could be the water bill they've overpaid, or the heating oil they've overpaid. There's a number of things. Sometimes they require proration, sometimes they don't. Heating oil won't, it would just require a measurement. But occasionally, like taxes, you may have overpaid them, paid them out through the rest of the year, and you need to get that money back, of course, because the seller shouldn't be on the hook for the real estate taxes for October, November, and December. They don't have the title to the property anymore. They're not living there anymore, so they should be off the hook, and so that money should come back to them as a credit on what we call the settlement statement. So with the settlement statement, it's basically just a balance sheet. It's a balance sheet. It's got a list of credits and debits on one side, list of credits and debits on the other. And if you just think about it this way, it should add up to 0 at the end, or shall be even if we think about it this way, like a scale. It should be even. There we go. So whatever you put on one side, you put on the other side, and the scale should even out. Now, actually, I drew this little scale here, inspired by Sal Khan from Khan Academy, and I realize that's the way he teaches his algebra class. I realize it's a fairly sad little scale, so we'll erase that one fairly quickly. But a settlement statement, sometimes called the HUD or the HUD-1. Now, there's a law that we're starting to rub up against, and we're going to talk more about in financing, called RESPA. RESPA. I'm going to actually spell that out for you now. It's important to kind of get a hold of that as soon as we can. Real Estate Settlement Procedure, which I'll just abbreviate ACT. Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, which oversees how all real estate transactions are closed in the United States. And recently, because of some changes in RESPA as of October of 2015, nowadays we don't call it the HUD. We call it the, what do we call it? Let's get rid of the HUD. We don't call it the HUD. We don't call it the HUD anymore, or the HUD 1. Nowadays we just call it the closing disclosure. And that's the new phrase that we're going to use for the HUD. The HUD 1 and the HUD itself have now been replaced by what we call the closing disclosure. And we're going to get into some rules when we talk about financing on how the closing disclosure must be distributed to the buyer in advance, so that they've always had to get it in advance, but previously it was not too much far in advance. And nowadays we call the HUD closing disclosure, the HUD, we call it the closing disclosure. A couple of other things that have changed over time with the change, just talked about this the other day with somebody. We used to always say that the loan lender had to provide a good faith estimate. Let me just write that out so you can get the whole phrase. Good faith estimate to the buyer within 3 business days. I think it typically was. Nowadays, we've just changed the name to that. Now we call it the loan estimate. And we'll get into more details of this when we talk about financing, but these numbers here can't vary from a certain percentage. Under the good faith estimate rule, it used to be 10% more or less, and with things have gotten a little stricter under the revision since October of 2015. And again, we'll talk about more about that when we get into financing. But a good faith estimate, or what we now call the loan estimate, is due to the borrower within a certain number of days after application. And in the end, whatever this loan estimate is, it can't vary by a certain percentage. And nowadays they've taken the items and put them in little buckets, so it's a little bit more technically confusing, but nonetheless, it's about 10% plus or minus per type of expenditure. So the loan estimate can't vary from the actual loan by more than basically 10% when we come to closing. So that way the borrower is able to follow the spirit of the new law, which is called know before you owe. Know before you owe. Know before you owe. Let's put that in there. The Know Before You Owe law, which is the new law which basically combined RESPA with another law, which again we'll talk about later when we get into financing, into a new law called TRID. I know you can't wait to get to financing. If you aren't waiting to get to financing now, you are now very, very excited, I'm sure, to talk about TRID in the upcoming module later in class. So very important. Closing costs, all regulated by TRID nowadays. So again, let's just the GFE is now the loan estimate, and you used to have to get that within 3 days. You still have to get it within 3 days now. And we don't call it the HUD anymore. We call it the closing disclosure. Closing disclosure. Another one of the I really think it's important for you to understand what RESPA is as a standalone law, even though you won't be learning it as a standalone law because, or practicing as it, because the new law, as we said now, is TRID. But one of the key ingredients of TRID is RESPA. That's what the R stands for in RESPA. And in order to understand TRID, you kind of have to understand RESPA as a standalone item. One of the other things, just for kicks, we'll just mention to you, we used to actually call the closing the closing. Now we call it the consummation. Consummation. Did I spell that right? I'm sure I didn't, but you know what I mean, how to spell it. There we go. Consummation. Yeah, we call it the consummation. That's the legal term for a closing nowadays. So let's go on to the next topic, and that's going to be, we're going to talk a little bit about tax. So since we were talking about property taxes, which of course are one of your biggest taxes that you have to pay on a quarterly basis. Let's go turn that pen to yellow for you. One of the more important aspects of buying the property is to make sure that you don't owe any taxes left over from the prior owner. So since we were talking about taxes, I think it would be good to make a quick detour and mention what a municipal tax certificate is. A municipal tax certificate, it's basically a statement from the town saying that these are the taxes, so they outline what the taxes are, and it basically gets the buyer off the hook for any future assessments that the seller was liable for in the past. So it means that you're buying the property for the taxes that are due now. The town can't somehow go back in the past and say the prior owner owed us some money and therefore the new person has to pay it. No, can't do that. So the municipal tax certificate helps out the buyer, making sure that the town's not going to be looking for additional monies at this time. So very important. The municipal tax certificate. Along with that, we should also probably mention some other types of taxes probably that you're familiar with, of course. The income tax. The income tax, everyone's familiar with that one. And the capital gains taxes. Sometimes when you sell a capital asset, you might have to pay capital gains tax. It's important to note that rental income that you get from rent, is taxed at the income tax rate that you pay, not a capital gain tax. And goes without saying, obviously, I am not an attorney. Jack is not an attorney, and nor am I an accountant or a CPA or anything like that. Jack's not either one of those types of things. I am not this, and I am not that. So anytime you need legal advice or CPA advice, contact somebody that is qualified in those fields. And, that's a good recommendation for you as well. Don't want to be giving tax advice or legal advice at any times if you're not qualified to do it. And there are some real estate brokers, for instance, that are also attorneys, and that would be a horse of a different color. But most of us are not attorneys that are real estate agents and or brokers, and most of us are not also a certified public accountant or that type of thing. So keep that in mind. Very good usage. So these are some taxes that you might have to be involved with as part of your closing. And, since we're talking about closings here for a second, I want to go just a little bit deeper into the concept of a short sale. I'm sure that some of you have seen this phrase before, but I thought it might be helpful to describe what a short sale is and kind of do some math for you on a short sale. Now, a short sale, I have a client right now trying to buy a house with a short sale. Let's say that the borrower owes $400,000, but currently on the market, they can only sell for $300,000. Uh-oh. That means they bought high and are selling low. No, that's not good. We want to buy low and sell high. Unfortunately, these folks bought it at the peak, most likely, and now they're unloading it down here near the bottom or somewhere near the bottom. So this is what they owe. They owe $400,000, but they can only sell for this much. Therefore, when they go to closing, they're going to be short $100,000. These are thousands of dollars. That is a short sale. So before you go to closing and show up there at closing, if you showed up at closing under this situation, you're going to kind of look like, well, it's kind of sad, but you're going to kind of look like this. You're going to you're going to be looking in your pockets, and nothing's going to fly out of there but moths, because there's nothing in your pocket. But you have a big problem. You're $100,000 short, and you should actually be showing up to the closing under this situation with $100,000 to make the deal close. But you can't, because you're short. At the closing, under the due on sale clause, which we'll mention in another lesson as well, the seller has to come up with the full $400,000 to satisfy the outstanding lien on the property, which is basically the outstanding mortgage, but they can only come up with $300,000 out of the proceeds. Therefore, theoretically, they'd have to come up with $100,000. If they can't come to the closing with $100,000, and then tell yourself which seller really wants to come to the closing with $100,000, then they have to apply to the lender for a short sale. Now, that does not mean a short sale does not mean it happens quick. It does not happen quick. It does not happen quick. It is going to take a very long time. So if we do most of our closings within, say, I don't know, it's going to take a long time. If we do most of our closings in a 30 to 40 days, 30 to, say, 45 days for your average, your short sale is probably going to take somewhere between 3 to 6 months on average. Because if you're asking the bank to consider taking, basically it's $100,000 loss, right? And if you're asking the bank to do that, then they're going to think long and hard about it, A, and B, there's some certain procedures that they have to go through in order to get that loss approved. Additionally, there may be other lien holders. There may be other lien holders other than the mortgage company itself. There could also be private mortgage insurance involved. They might take a hit, as they might lose part of this $100,000. So there's processes that these companies have in place to take a look at a short sale and say, hey, is this a good deal for us or not? Very often it's a question, just a business question sometimes, and also certain legal parameters. Hey, is there any way that the property market might go back up again? So, as we talked earlier, you got this kind of loop, right, where things go up and down. Should we wait it out? Also, is it very possible that if we don't take the short sale now, might be better to lose $100,000 now, or if the lender declines the $100,000 loss, they might own the property. Why? Well, the current owner might say, okay, I can't sell it. It's going to be a long time before the property value goes back up again, and therefore they might do what's called a default, which was going to obviously lead to a foreclosure. So sometimes it's a game of chicken in the case of a short sale. I think this is a good time where we should actually just kind of outline the general process of selling a property. And, we're going to use a basic $350,000 house just to kind of outline this, so we have a general idea of the steps. We'll call this the steps of the sale. So I wondered if your own idea, what you think the number one step of the sale is. Number one step, if you know, just type it in there. Let me know. Steps to closing. Steps to closing. Anyone at all? Well, the number one is a little bit of a trick question. and it's not actually part of real estate school, but you need a lead. You actually need someone who wants to list their house and sell their property. Without a lead, nothing happens. So remember, this business is all about leads, and the next part of it, of course, is listings. If you don't have somebody calling you up and saying they want to sell their house, then you're never going to get any listings. And if you don't get any listings, well, then you're probably not going to be the most successful real estate agent, although it is possible to succeed without having listings. But listings, for a number of varieties of reasons, is a much better thing. For instance, I'll just give you a quick, this sounds crazy, but if you're working with buyers only, can you put a lawn sign in front of the person's house that you're helping buy something from? No. So you can't put a lawn sign in front of their house if they're the buyer. You can only put a lawn sign in front of a listing. So that and many other reasons, it's much better to have listings than actual buyers. In most markets, it does vary. So once we get a listing agreement, this is probably should say agreement, it's going to be a written document between the seller and the listing agency. Then they're going to market the property. And part of marketing the property in most instances is going to be entering it into the MLS. Also in this category, there might be open houses. There could be videos. This is when you're going to hire the drone. All sorts of marketing stuff going to happen at step number 3. Then after step number 3, hopefully, cross your fingers, you're going to receive an offer. And we're going to talk more about offers later on in the class. And then you're going to present that offer to your seller forthwith. By the way, that sounds like a good trust question. Forthwith, we'll mention that later in class as well, to the seller, and hopefully they'll accept it. So they have to accept the offer. Very, very important. It's not good enough to just list your house. The offer has to be accepted. And technically speaking, you should also know that listing your house is not an offer in and of itself. If you list your house, it's not like you put something on the shelf at Walmart. Someone can't just come to the front counter, and if it's marked $5.99, you buy it for $5.99. No, listing your house way up here under this step here is just an invitation to receive offers. We'll look at offers, but we're not necessarily accepting them, even if they're at the exact list price or they meet all the consideration that we're looking for. So you can list your property, and this certainly does happen, and someone actually offers you list price, and they'll say they'll close whenever it's convenient to you, and the seller still declines it. That can happen. It does happen occasionally. Usually, though, when someone wants to sell their house, they're going to get an offer at list price. Typically, they are going to accept it. But it's an important step to maintain. So you should know that as part of the process. The next thing, most likely, is going to be the home inspection. Home inspection. So the home inspection usually going to have, let's get that right. As you all know, I can't spell. There we go. Home inspection. It's even tougher with this fancy marker, the magic pen. Usually you got 10 days to accomplish the home inspection, and during this time the buyer is going to be looking at the property, usually with a licensed home inspector and maybe even some specialists as well, for things that are wrong with the property. And sometimes that we're going to just move on from this. I hope you have this on your page if you're taking notes. Then we're going to probably go to a period which is a renegotiate. Usually there's going to be a little renegotiating. This usually is relatively minor, hopefully, and usually somehow revolves around the home inspection. You know, they found a leaky roof or something along the home inspection that needs to be fixed, or might justify a reduction in the price of the property, or might justify something that needs to be improved by code before closing. So there can be financial adjustments at this time, or things that you're going to, as the buyer, ask the seller to fix before closing. Then we're usually going to go, and it's not required, but it is customary, to a purchase and sale agreement. A purchase and sale agreement. And these purchase and sale agreements are drafted by your professional associations, just like the offer is. And nowadays, often lawyers add on addendums to these purchase and sales agreements. And there is a spot where you can obviously carry over language as an agent, especially language about the washer and dryer, whether that's included, or the swing set, that type of thing. You can carry over that language without actually practicing law, but usually you're just taking information directly from the listing sheet, cutting and pasting it, and added it into the additional provisions section. So the offer is binding, and you can take someone to closing with just an offer. That's a very important point. But traditionally, in an offer, there'll be a requirement that the parties go to a purchase and sale agreement. Usually that's going to be about 15, maybe 20 days out from the accepted offer. Now, the next thing that's going to happen is the bank or the lender is going to step in, if there's a lender involved, and they're going to take a look at the property from an appraisal point of view. They're going to ask a question from an appraisal point of view. Is the agreed upon price justified? Is it justified? Why are they going to be asking for that? Well, heaven forbid you break your commitment and don't send in your money, then they're going to collect the property through foreclosure. Of course, that's a bad thing. We don't like to hear about that, but it is a true thing, and the bank needs to protect itself so that they don't lose value. So they're going to be making sure that their appraisal, their opinion of value, is at or higher than the sales price. At or higher than the sales price. A very important step. Very, very important step. The appraisal. Nowadays, usually you just have the appraisal done. They're stopped by the property for 30, 45 minutes, something like that, in your normal single-family home. And then they'll report back to the lender. There are significant buffers, I guess we'll say, that have been put in place over the years so that there isn't a over familiarity with the appraiser, and so that it's really a round robin situation where you get whatever appraiser is sent to you, and there's less favoritism in the whole appraisal industry. I certainly remember 15 or 20 years ago where if you got an appraisal and you didn't like it, and these were the times, as Alan Greenspan might once said, times of irrational exuberance, you could actually call up your appraiser and say, "Hey buddy, how are you? Hey, I got my appraisal back. Thank you for doing it so quickly. I just looked at it, and gee, gosh golly, I really kind of need an extra $20,000 in valuation. I see that you didn't include the house that sold last week. Could you come over and or take another look at it?" And oftentimes they would. And nowadays there's a buffer basically between the appraisers and the buying public and the lenders themselves as well. So usually you would ask for that type of thing when the market was consistently going up, because it was going up at such a speed that sometimes the appraisal data couldn't keep up with the actual prices out there, and therefore something sold, say even 30 or 60 days ago, would have sold for less than what it sells now. So of course, whenever you have this type of thing, they usually also have this type of thing shortly thereafter. And nowadays, in order to protect the lenders, we make sure that the appraisers operate basically in a bubble so that they're not influenced by repetitive contact with lenders in particular. Remember, of course, that the lenders in particular, in order to protect the property owner, the lender gets an appraiser. Remember that for the most part, most people, if you have any type of insurance policy or bank account or 401k or Fidelity bank account, I don't want to use a brand name, but whatever, you know what I mean, chances are that you have a small amount of money that is also invested in the mortgage industry through what we call the secondary mortgage market, which we'll talk about later in financing. So once we get the appraisal, then we're going to get what we call the mortgage commitment. Now, this is a letter that the buyer gets, and nowadays it's not uncommon for this not to come. I don't know, if we're looking at a 45-day close, this might not come until like day 30. So from a seller's point of view, you don't really know if you can close until about 2 weeks out from the closing. If we're closing on day 45 and you don't get the mortgage commitment letter until day 30, then that's only 2 weeks difference, right? 15 days. And then, of course, you get a little worried about it. So but that's how it works. So the mortgage commitment letter is going to happen after the appraisal, because remember, from a lender's point of view, they need to look at the buyer's qualification, and then they also need to look, which they can do in advance, or as soon as the application is made, and then they have to do a look at the asset, because heaven forbid the mortgage isn't paid, they're going to acquire the asset through foreclosure, and they want to make sure that the value, as I mentioned earlier, is at or higher than the appraised point, the appraisal. So the value is at or higher than the appraisal. So they want to protect to make sure that if they have to foreclose, the value is there for them to recoup. Now, after we get the mortgage commitment, there could be some other steps, and then we'll mention those later in the class as well. But in some towns, you're going to need a water reading or a sewer reading. Definitely going to be, these are important. I don't want to say that they're minor steps. You very well might need your fire department to come and talk to you as well about your carbon monoxide and smoke detectors. We're going to get into that in a different time. But these are all important things that are organized in part or in whole by your real estate agent, depending upon how it's handled with the buyer. And then lastly, of course, is the closing. So just a quick, brief, very brief, there's a lot of other moving parts that are going on here. I just want to kind of outline the basic steps to a closing so that you had a sense of these steps. So the last ones are the mortgage commitment letter, which typically the mortgage commitment letter, when it comes in, most of the purchase and sales agreements do not require the mortgage commitment letter to be furnished to the seller's side, but that is a provision that I like to see more and more often, so that not only does the mortgage commitment letter come in and there's a date, a deadline associated with it, but that the letter is actually provided to the seller. That's a common courtesy, but doesn't always happen. And then you do some of these preliminary steps over the next 2 weeks. Of course, before the closing, I forgot to mention, of course, just before the closing, we'll call it step 11A, and that's going to be the walkthrough. So if you're closing at 10 a.m. On any particular day, typically you're going to have a walkthrough like at 8 a.m. So if we have an 8 a.m. walkthrough, and a 10 a.m. closing. I like to get to the property not at 8 a.m. and not at 7 a.m. I actually like to get to the property, if it's my listing, I like to get to the property, as a little tip for you, a pro tip for you, the day before at 5 p.m. Therefore, if I show up at 5 p.m. before the closing and there's something wrong with the property, oh, I don't know, it just could be trash, or the seller's left behind stuff. Then it's 5 o'clock that night. The walkthrough's the next day, almost, 9? I got 9 hours to figure things out, or 9, 10 hours, whatever it happens to be, to figure things out. I still have some daylight, hopefully, and I can take care of the trash. I can take care of the stuff. Oftentimes, by the way, this is a chance where you're gonna be your seller's gonna be, wow, thank you for going back and finding the family heirloom or whatever it is that you tracked down, or you found the dog's collar or whatever it happened to be. We couldn't find it. Sellers leave behind stuff all the time. Sometimes they'll leave behind stuff which they intended to leave behind, but you got to make sure that this walkthrough goes through well. So occasionally, as a real estate agent, since you can't get paid until after the closing, until after you're on record, you very much want the walkthrough to go well, and therefore you might actually do a little housekeeping if you have to. So I tend to, as best practice, is go back to the property the day before, like at 5 o'clock, just to kind of do the walkthrough, a pre-walkthrough walkthrough. We got into this discussion of the sales process by talking about short sales. Let's continue on and talk about a few other ways we can avoid a short sale or avoid a foreclosure. One is called a loan mod, or officially a loan modification. Now, I remember after 2008, which used to sound recent, but it's actually now, 9 years ago. It's actually getting to be quite a distance. But 2008, 2009, 2010, loan modifications were all the rage. Tons of people got them, and as a result of the financial crisis of 2008, and basically you called up your bank and said, hey, I can't afford this mortgage anymore. What can we do to renegotiate the rate, renegotiate the term, to make it more affordable? So heaven forbid you were looking at possibly selling your house and taking a loss. Sometimes people said, well, what can I do to save the house and to make my mortgage payment more affordable? And you did a loan modification. Nowadays, you don't see as many loan modifications, but there are plenty out there. Back in 2009 and 10, they were all the rage. It was very, very easy to get a loan modification. I think they've probably tightened down on the requirements for that. And the other one is a deed in lieu of foreclosure. That's not a W, Jack. Come on now. That is a U. I should know better. There we go. That's a U. Deed in lieu of foreclosure. And basically, you're just surrendering your house. You're saying, forget about it. I can't pay it. I'm not going to have you go through the whole foreclosure procedure. But in anyways, whether it's foreclosure or a deed in lieu of foreclosure, in the end, it becomes bank owned, and sometimes referred to as REO, real estate owned. My father was a banker, and he taught me a long time ago that banks, this is a house, banks do not like to own property. They do not like to own property. Property to them is a hassle, to say the least. What they want to own, of course, is the note. They'd much rather save the deal. Mostly, for the most part, they'd rather save the deal and own the note. In other words, be getting money on a monthly basis than have to own the property. So bank-owned property happens when foreclosure happens, or when the deed in lieu of foreclosure. And you definitely used to see these terms a little bit more commonly in 2009 and 10 and 11. We do still have many foreclosures in the marketplace, but not as I'm speaking to you now in 2016, early 2017. But fewer than in terms of the volume of foreclosures out there. So Bank-owned property, you do see them. They're a business opportunity for sure to get these bank-owned property listings, because typically they don't want to own it. As I said, they want to sell it. Sometimes they're selling it for a loss. At one time, actually, I considered getting into the business. A friend of mine and I were getting into the business where you'd go to these properties here and you'd winterize them, cut the grass and that type of thing, and not a very profitable business, very low margins, so we decided not to do that. But the bank's got to take care of it. So not something they like to do, and they're looking for real estate agents and real estate brokers. Usually they have to prove to have been in the business for a while, so it's not something that new agents typically do to sell the bank-owned property should a foreclosure or deed in lieu of foreclosure occur. So thank you so much for joining us on this recorded portion of Lesson 2. My name is Jack Gately. I'm the owner of the Real Estate School and of Jack Gately Real Estate. Looking forward to speaking to you again when you take the other lessons, of which there are a total of 8 full recorded lessons. So let's get into a discussion of Lesson 2 live on the webinar.